Alright guys, we knew that we were going to have to talk about this eventually. So a couple of days ago, news came out that Kathleen Kennedy was going to be retiring from Lucasfilm, as head of Lucasfilm. And obviously all of the wrong people got the wrong idea from this, and obviously we're celebrating, like literally so many videos talking about how people won. And it's just, I don't necessarily want to get into that because the thought is those people are usually pretty wrong about these things, and they're just doing it for hate bait farming just to line their pocketbooks. That's literally what it is. The truth is that if there is one big issue with Star Wars, it's not Kathleen Kennedy, it's Disney trying to push this brand that was always supposed to be, you know, something that we got every couple of decades, every couple of years or something, and was only really supposed to be on the big screen, not necessarily being pushed in all ways in games, comic books, television, and everything else down our throats at every given moment. They just tried to expand it too quickly, and too much of an interconnection between all of the various storylines. It just didn't work, and quite frankly, this is something I want to talk about in the future. The idea that any type of extended universe, and whether or not it can work if it's trying to be too adherent to its own canon, even though Star Wars isn't, it certainly is because everything is connected. Again, more on that in another day. But the point here being, Kathleen Kennedy is not retiring, at least not anytime soon. She did a recent interview to kind of clarify some stuff as well as talk about the future of Star Wars, so I wanted to get into that right now. Starting off the interview by saying the truth is, and I just want to say out loud and clear, I am not retiring. I will never retire from movies. I will die making movies. That's the first thing that's important to say. I'm not retiring. What's happening at Lucasfilm is I have been talking for quite some time with both Bob and Alan about what eventually succession might look like. She goes on to say that that's not a done deal. They don't know who's going to be her immediate successor, although it might be Jon Favreau. That would be my guess if I had to put money on it. Just because of how he's been at the forefront of so many things that have been successful for Disney over the last couple of decades, being one of the defining factors that made the MCU what it is at the very beginning, and then kind of showing that Disney Plus can have a huge hit with The Mandalorian right as that streaming service took off. I guess we're gonna have to wait and see how The Mandalorian and Grogu does, but quite frankly, he's my pick. I don't think it's gonna be Kevin Feige. He has too much going on with trying to rebrand the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a dominant force in entertainment again, which might be too big of a task. And then maybe not Dave Filoni. Obviously, he was the best in terms of the lore, but some of the things that they've given him, at least on the television front, just haven't really worked with the general audience. Maybe some big fans, but not necessarily the general audience. Anyway, I would actually love to have that conversation in the comments, but let's just move on. The big point about this particular video or this discussion that Kathleen Kennedy had was to inform everybody about the current state of Star Wars and what we can expect to see in the coming future. Obviously, here in the next couple of weeks, we're going to get season 2 of Andor, and we know we have Ahsoka season 2 coming out sometime in the future. I'm not entirely sure when that's supposed to drop. But other than that, not a whole lot on the calendar until Mandalorian and Grogu in 2026. So yeah, what is the next big thing, especially on the big screen when it comes to Star Wars? Well, according to Kathleen Kennedy, Sean Levi's Star Wars movie will be the next after Mandalorian and Grogu, which we haven't heard a ton about other than it's supposed to be standalone and that Ryan Gosling is supposed to be starring. When they first said that this was moving forward, they at least indicated that if they can get Ryan Gosling to star in the movie, it was going to be fast-tracked. But you know, quite frankly, it's been just a couple of years since they started talking about James Mangold's Jedi Origins movie, or the Rey New Order Jedi movie that they've been talking about and maybe even pushing in one direction or another for the last couple of years, making it either Simon Kinberg's trilogy or maybe that original thing that was supposed to take place 15 years after The Rise of Skywalker. There's just a lot of ambiguity on what the future of the franchise is, especially things that take place immediately after The Rise of Skywalker. Well, that's why this is important, because apparently even though the Sean Levi movie is a standalone film with Ryan Gosling starring, it is going to be taking place after Rise of Skywalker. So there's at least that. We are finally moving forward in the timeline instead of focusing on this New Republic era that the television shows have been swimming around in for pretty much the last 5 years. But other than that, I don't think we have a whole lot of understanding of what this movie is going to be about, what it's going to be focusing on, and what it ultimately means for the future of the series. My guess would be is that the Mandalorian and Grogu movie is going to do its best to end, or at least set up the ending of this New Republic era from the television shows so they can kind of forget about that, and that this Sean Levi movie is going to reintroduce the world to a new Star Wars canon, or at least a new concept of what Star Wars can be on a theatrical level. Possibly even getting into a point where Star Wars is going to be taking a huge step back from television and focusing more on cinematic offerings. And that's kind of the implication that Kennedy gave too when she talked about what was coming after the Sean Levi movie and the Mandalorian and Grogu. Talking about the future and how Simon Kinberg's trilogy that we talked about recently is possibly the next big thing after this. She said, this is the next iteration, the next new saga that moves us into the future. And like we've discussed on this channel before, there's a lot of back and forth about what that means for the future of the franchise, considering the fact that the new Jedi Order movie, the one with Rey set 15 years after the Rise of Skywalker, that was supposed to be a bridge into the new era of Star Wars. But a lot of people have been reporting that the new Simon Kinberg trilogy is supposed to be somewhat of a next generation type of movie, using Rey as kind of an Obi-Wan Kenobi role and moving on from the Skywalker concept entirely. That's just going to be the future of Star Wars. And you know what? I do have a couple of things to say about that, but I do want to just get through the rest of these updates about where Star Wars is going, at least on television and cinematic front for the future, before we get into some of my criticisms about the future of this franchise. So in this interview, Kathleen Kennedy went on to talk about the New Republic era, which we've already talked about, being at least the current era that we are in right now in terms of the television shows. And like I said, there's some implication that that's going to be being phased out here in the next coming years, with Mandalorian and Grogu and Ahsoka Season 2 and everything else like that. It's not that they're going to forget about that entirely, but it's certainly not going to be the focus going forward. She gave some implication of what's happening with the James Mangold movie, just saying that he's very busy with all this other stuff right now and he just can't focus on Star Wars. The same thing she said about Taika Waititi coming into Star Wars and doing his movie, saying that, yeah, he's writing it on the side, but nothing is really happening because he's just so busy doing all this other stuff and it's hard to tie him down. Other than that, Kathleen Kennedy didn't give any implication of what's happening with the Rey Skywalker movie that was announced 2 years ago. And I just don't really know what to think about this. It's not that I love the sequel trilogy. I don't know a whole lot of people who do. But Daisy Ridley did her best with that role, and I feel like there's at least something there. I think a lot of people understand that when it comes to viability of characters that were introduced within the sequel trilogy, other than Finn, Rey's probably the biggest type of character that you can take and move on with a new movie or something in between. And quite frankly, the implication that a Simon Kinberg trilogy is going to regulate Rey as like kind of this old wise woman to a much younger cast doesn't necessarily betray what Star Wars is supposed to be, but I feel like it's just moving the needle further than it needs to go. We never really got any meaningful continuation of Han, Luke, or Leia, especially after Return of the Jedi, and that's probably because Lucas just couldn't think of a meaningful idea. He had a plan in mind that was just kind of coming together very slowly. Couldn't get the funding. I mean, there was just a myriad of reasons as to why we waited so long to do a sequel trilogy where all three of our main characters were way out of their prime by the time they came back. We don't really have that problem now. And the idea of picking up after the sequel trilogy, even though a lot of people do hate it, myself kind of included, there's something interesting about that. And I feel like there's a lot of potential there to make a good movie. Because look, if there's one thing that I am very much passionate about, or at least understand, is anything can be good. You just need the right people behind it and telling the right story. The first three movies of this franchise do not define Rey as a character. So you can be reintroduced to the audience because at this point, so many years have passed. People know about her. They might not fully remember the sequel trilogy and how much of a bad taste that left in their mouth. And if they go to see a decent film, then, that heals all wounds and they're getting excited for what's coming next. And it feels like a direct continuation of the things that we saw just, a decade ago. To me, that makes a lot of sense, and I would love to see that as the main focal point going forward. Not just simply jumping directly into the future with a completely new story, a completely new protagonist, and no longer within that Skywalker saga. I mean, obviously, we're not necessarily in the Skywalker saga now because Rey isn't technically a Skywalker, but tell me in the comment section below if you agree with any of this. But quite frankly, when it comes to the continuation of Star Wars, I was excited more than anything about that Rey movie because I feel like there's potential there to change people's minds about the continuation of these characters. Not necessarily going back and looking at it with nostalgia goggles and saying, yeah, the sequel trilogy was better than what people were talking about. It isn't. In the same way that the prequels aren't as good as all the Gen Z and everybody talks about right now, like, oh, those are great. No, they're not. But if the prequels have kind of taught us anything, is that all the stuff made around them, that is what creates the nostalgia. Like, there's a lot of really good content set in the era that those movies are based around, or at least kind of connected to, where people watch the Clone Wars, people watch all of this stuff, or read the comic books or stuff that's set in between those time periods that those movies are based. And that kind of gives them more of a context of how to go back and rewatch those three movies and gives them more of an appreciation for what they were trying to do. Setting a movie 15 years later after the sequels might not necessarily do that or might not be the catalyst of that, but you do get to a point where you start doing enough good things within that era and with these characters that people are going to go back and look at the sequel trilogy with more nostalgia than they did when they were initially watching it when it was coming out in 2015 onward. That's my perspective here. And that's one of the reasons I would love to see a continuation with Rey in that regard and not necessarily what Simon Kinberg has been planning, or at least the leaks that have been coming out with that. All that being said, I just wanted to cover very briefly what Daisy Ridley said about the upcoming new Jedi Order movie and how, at least if Kathleen Kennedy is not going to talk about it, at least there is some movement in that regard, and this movie is still seemingly being written. They haven't just thrown it away entirely. So, getting back to her quote, Ridley says, "I don't think it's the next thing I go to production on because I'm supposed to be doing, oh no, it's not because I'm doing something next month. Very excitingly. So it's not the next thing production-wise, but the script is being written and I'm very excited." She goes on to say that she hasn't read the newest part of the script yet, but she's at least aware of where the story is going and that the people around the script are very talented. Again, I feel like this is something that should have had way more development on it as at this point. They announced it just a couple of years ago. I mean, it doesn't take that long to make a movie unless you're Blade. But quite frankly, that brings us back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this video. Kathleen Kennedy has announced a ton of movies and television shows and projects when it comes to the continuation of Star Wars, and very few of them have come to fruition. The idea that Star Wars is supposed to be this huge spectacle, or that Disney and Lucasfilm have any real meaningful plan about what to do with this franchise going forward, goes out the door when pretty much everything you have, every person that you get attached, every thing that you announce kind of blows up in your face. Kathleen Kennedy in this recent interview might not be talking about retiring anytime soon or immediately announcing the date where she's going to leave Lucasfilm, but it's just the same as everything else that we've seen thus far. She's coming back and saying, hey, all that stuff we've been talking about for literally years now. Well, it's still happening in the background, but it's just not coming together as fast as we want. And the problem with that is this is just such a reoccurring theme when it comes to anything that Lucasfilm has talked about or announced or done within the last over a decade now. Ever since Disney bought Lucasfilm for $4 billion, there's been so much projects that they've wanted to do and have done that just either fall apart before they even begin or fall apart during the production itself. And even though I do not appreciate a lot of the people who focus on Kennedy as the bane of their existence or the person who destroyed Star Wars, there is no denying the fact that she is the head of Lucasfilm, and there's been considerable problems, more so than a lot of other comparable movie studios or big Universal franchises as of late. Like, there's been a whole lot of problems, and maybe that falls on her feet because she's the head of this organization, but there's just something wrong with Lucasfilm. So, quite frankly, a change, successor to her, someone who can get the reins back and start making Star Wars exciting again, is something that I would love to see. My only problem is I would love to see some kind of continuation or rehabilitation of the sequel trilogy, because that's what they decided to do. I don't want them to retcon it. I just want them to make it retroactively meaningful or exciting. Maybe not just to me or me at all, but like at least the younger generations growing up with it. You only have so many times that you can make a first impression. And the idea that the Simon Kinberg trilogy is just going to kind of forget the sequel trilogy altogether and move on with something new, that's fine, but Star Wars has never been that big of a universe. It's always been a family story. Continue with the people that we understand, or at least we know right now, and give them a meaningful future, a meaning beyond what was seen in those 3 films. That's just my thoughts. Tell me in the comments section below what y'all's thoughts here are, because I'm interested in having this discussion. I hope everyone's having a fantastic day.